As the ship carrying the 12 Quarp delegates approached the large Negotiation Center station, which was in orbit around the system's largest gas giant, there was no hiding the relief and elation amongst the gossiping officials.
I can't believe he let us get away with it. Those mammals are so noble, but so very naive. Finally, we get a decisive advantage over those smelly Quist. How could the Galactic Council let a simpleton race become negotiators? Amazing! Quiet!
The loud voice of the ambassador cut through the hubbub, creating a sudden silence. The Quarp were an insectoid species, and the ambassador, being of the drone caste and a thorax taller than his subordinates, had a louder and deep voice.
It is important that when we meet for the negotiation, we are serious and show no sign of happiness. We must seem to be reluctant to agree to this. This human may be easily manipulated, but he is observant. I have studied the human culture, and we must continue to impress on the human how honorable and fair we are. Watch yourselves. We must play our part well.
Shortly after the ship docked, the ambassador led his chastened retinue directly to the main negotiation chamber in the center of the station. The quiz delegation was already positioned behind a long table on one side of the room. The human was sitting at a small table to one side on the center line, so the Quarp put themselves behind the other long table, facing the quiz. The ambassador sat at one end, near the human. The quiz did not have castes, were wingless with 8 rather than 6 legs, and were all the same size, slightly smaller than the Quarp, and didn't seem to have a leader or spokesbeing. Their translator was positioned in the middle of their table, and they all seemed to speak into it at the same time.
Great,
said the human, smacking the ends of his 2 upper appendages together with a sharp sound. Now we are all here, we can start. Now before I begin this second and final session, let me remind you that I am here on behalf of the Galactic Council, and both parties have agreed that this is a binding negotiation process. A violation of the negotiation process, or the ceasefire, may lead the Galactic Council and the Human Federation to sanction the offending party or respond militarily. Is that understood? The human lowered his eyebrows and looked from one table to the other. Apart from some indistinct murmurings from the translator units and shuffling noises, there was no response. After a pause, the human straightened up and smiled. Good. Now, in our first session it was agreed by both parties that there would be an equitable and even 50-50 division of all the resources of this system. As the Quarp have more prospecting ships and scanning equipment, I have asked them to compile a list of all resources in the system, and split them into 2 sectors of equal value. They have given me the full report, and all parties have had 2 days to review this. Before we go any further, are there any questions about the report? The quiz translator immediately buzzed loudly.
Yes, the Quarp report is completely unfair and allocates all of the important resources for Quist to the Quarp sector.
Is that so? The human raised his eyebrow. Are you accusing the Quarp of bias or malicious action?
Without doubt, both. For example, all of the niobium-rich asteroids which we need are solely in their sector.
That is a serious charge. The human turned to face the Quarp table. How do you respond to this accusation?
It may look like that with their inferior shallow scanners, but there are deep resources in the moons and asteroids we have scanned in their sector, which greatly increase their value, perhaps even more overall than in ours. The allocation is fair, the ambassador replied calmly. You can't believe that utter nonsense, the quiz buzzed.
Both sides started buzzing and screeching loudly across the tables at each other, overwhelming the ability of the translator units to make sense. After a few moments, the human stood up, clapped his hands, and with a surprisingly loud voice said, "Shut up!" When it was quiet, he turned to the Quarp table again. It is important that we know the allocation is fair. Even to my untrained eye, it looks a bit skewed. How can we be certain?
We take great pride in the accuracy of our prospecting. Our whole exploration process depends on it. I can vouch for the honor and skill of our mining engineers.
the ambassador stiffly responded. After a pause, he added a human expression of confidence he had come across. Trust me, bro. The human leaned back in his chair with his chin on his fist. I think we need a bit more than that statement. After some thought, he leaned forward. I understand that there is a serious oath that droves make to the Hive, which pledges their honor in matters of life or death. I have a recording of it, in fact. If you pledge an oath on the Hive that the report is unbiased, I will accept that. After a rather long pause, the ambassador replied in an unsteady voice. That old oath thing is a historic relic. It has no relevance today, and I don't need to use it. I don't think I can recall the words anyway. The human smiled. No need to recall, I have the recording here, remember. If you can't agree to take the oath, I will have to restart the negotiations. And the next time I will ask the Quits to perform the resource survey and allocation. If the oath is just an old relic, you should have no problem taking it, should you? After another long pause, the ambassador slowly nodded agreement. He haltingly recited the oath, and affirmed the report was unbiased and fair. The human carefully listened to the oath and the recording, and then nodded. Okay, I am now prepared to formally accept that the report is unbiased and fair. The quiz group immediately spoke up. This negotiation is a complete farce. We will be making a complaint to the council about your biased and incompetent role. The human nodded. You have every right to. However, until they review and decide the complaint, you must continue to follow my procedures. As the quiz started making louder, untranslatable buzzing noises, the human quickly held up his hand and said, If you interfere with the proceedings, I can remove you from the meeting, so please be quiet. After the buzzing died down, the human stood and cleared his throat. There is one issue that needs to be clarified before we move on to the next stage. Both delegations have referred to the Quop and the Quist sectors, but I was quite clear in my instructions that the split into sectors were not pre-assigned to any group, just that they have equal value. But the split is closely aligned with areas that the Quop and the Quist have already been mining in. It is only natural that the sectors are assigned to make best use of existing mining stations, the Quop ambassador quickly interjected. That may have been your assumption when you decided the split, but I am not bound by that, the human replied. This brings me to the second step of the negotiation. In the first step, the Quop expertly and fairly split the value of the system into two sectors with equal value. It is the turn of the Quist in the second step to choose which of the two sectors they want to take. There was a pause of several seconds, while the delegations absorbed this information. Then the Quop ambassador exploded. This is completely unfair. The human tilted his head slightly. Why? Because we can't make a profit in this system without the niobium asteroids. The human raised an eyebrow. How can that be? You have just sworn an honor oath that the sectors have equal value. While the ambassador struggled to find a reply, the quiz group quietly stated, We choose the sector with the niobium asteroids. The human wrote something down and said, Thank you for the quick decision. Well, I think this concludes the negotiation. Are there any final points? Yes, responded the Quop ambassador. We will be reporting that this negotiation was unfair because you chose us to make the split and them to choose the sector. That was completely arbitrary and put the Quop at a disadvantage. The human sighed. Well, you are free to make a complaint. I doubt it will get anywhere, but for the record I chose you to compile the resources and make the split because you kept emphasizing your honor and fairness during our initial meeting. Any disadvantage is entirely of your own doing. The human stood and picked up his papers. It is time for us to leave. I will take my report and the negotiation results to the council. I will remind you that there are exits at both ends of this room. This station has automatic defenses and targeting systems that will respond to weapons fire or explosions in or near the station, and the council has monitoring satellites watching the system. Happy mining, and goodbye.